Welcome to today's Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're unpacking the truly fascinating mechanics of how independent media ecosystems can take a single, combative television interview and transform it into this massive, multi-layered political narrative. We're going to be looking at a collection of really popular online commentators to examine exactly how they build their arguments, connect seemingly unrelated dots, and broadcast a perfectly unified message to literally millions of viewers.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be looking at 1. The rain-soaked NBC interview, 2. Analyzing media bias claims, 3. California election controversies, 4. Immigration and visa frustrations, and finally, 5. The anatomy of viral narratives. Let's see how all these disparate topics fit together.
To understand this whole ecosystem, we've got to start right at the catalyst. Let's call it quits because I've had enough. Thank you, darling. Wow, that explosive climax from the interview immediately captured the internet's attention. And honestly, it served as the absolute epicenter for the commentary we're about to unpack. Across multiple independent channels, this single quote was replayed, analyzed, and celebrated as this moment of ultimate defiance against the mainstream press. But how do we actually get to that walk-off? Section 1. The rain-soaked NBC interview. Let's set the scene of this really combative, rain-drenched Meet the Press interview with Kristen Welker, out in a barn in Wisconsin. This sequence brilliantly illustrates the rapid escalation of the whole event, showing just how fast the conversation fractured. Notice the timeline here. It kicks off at minute 1 with a super tense debate over a so-called anti-weaponization fund to compensate folks involved in January 6th. The sources note how the former president argues 97% of those involved were mistreated by dirty cops, while the interviewer repeatedly states, there's just no evidence of this. By minute 3, the timeline violently shifts to a heated exchange about the Iran nuclear deal and uranium enrichment, before completely pivoting out of nowhere at minute 5 to California's local election counting speed. Finally, the whole thing ends at minute 6 with that viral walk-off, where the microphone is literally removed. The independent sources we analyze point to this exact timeline as definitive proof that the interview was designed as a trap, not a conversation. Section 2. Analyzing media bias claims. Now, here's how the commentators use this specific interview to springboard into a much broader discussion about deep-seated media distrust.
Have you ever felt like a debate was just kind of rigged from the start? Well, the crucial point here is how the sources analyze the actual mechanics of this debate. During the interview, Kristen Welker repeatedly tells the former president, "There is no evidence of what you're saying." But the independent commentators view this tactic, repeatedly demanding immediate hyper-specific evidence on the spot, not as objective journalism but as deliberate framing designed to obscure the truth. One source, actually speaking from their background as a communications professor, argues that the host is purposely leaving out nuanced evidence just to manipulate the audience. They argue that when the media dismisses claims outright without engaging in the underlying frustration, they're basically acting in bad faith.
To justify this intense frustration and that eventual walk-off, commentators cite a really striking statistic, that the former president receives 96% negative press. In their view, the media acts as a totally hostile entity rather than an objective observer. They argue that this overwhelmingly negative coverage proves the press is fundamentally broken, which, for them, entirely validates the decision to abruptly end the interview and just drop the microphone.
Section 3. California election controversies. Let's move to our next pillar and see how this builds into their second major grievance, the actual integrity of voting mechanisms, zeroing in specifically on California. During the interview, the topic abruptly shifts to California, and the commentators we analyze take this and totally run with it. They cleanly list specific procedural grievances as undeniable proof of what they categorize as an illegitimate and, quote, rigged system. They point out that out of 16 million votes cast, 13 million used mail-in ballots. And these ballots? They're automatically sent to all registered voters, whether requested or not. Combine that with a complete lack of mandatory ID requirements and election results taking over 30 days to finalize, and these sources argue that the system is just ripe for manipulation. So why does this matter? Well, because for these commentators and their viewers, these procedural details aren't just boring administrative choices. They're viewed as deliberate vulnerabilities, engineered to obscure the true will of the voter. To really hammer this point home, the sources use a striking logistical contrast. They point out that India recently counted a massive 600 million votes in a single day. Let that sink in. In stark contrast, they argue, California takes weeks to count roughly 16 million votes.
For these independent commentators, this delayed counting in a single American state isn't just bureaucratic inefficiency. They argue it's a national embarrassment that's deliberately done by design to manipulate the outcomes.
And they don't just stick to macro-level state politics either. To prove their point, our sources zoom in on a highly specific, hyper-local city council race in Los Angeles between Spencer Pratt and Nikki Rahman. The commentators claim that sudden, late-night ballot dumps magically reversed Pratt's lead in favor of the establishment candidate Rahman. They use this granular local example as the ultimate proof of concept for their broader claims about election integrity, arguing that the system is literally designed to protect establishment politicians at all costs.
Section 4. Immigration and visa frustrations. Now, you might be wondering, how on earth do local LA elections connect to federal policy? Well, for these commentators, the perceived dishonesty in the interview and local elections is directly linked to a deliberate obscuring of our next topic, immigration policy. The sources ground their arguments in highly specific data to paint a picture of a system being totally exploited. They highlight a staggering claim, citing a report from a former official, that up to 90% of H-1B high-skilled visa applications from India contain fraudulent documents or fake degrees, compared to just 10% legitimate applications. That's a huge disparity. They argue that this visa pipeline is basically bringing in cheap labor to undercut American workers, all while the mainstream media completely ignores the story.
They build on this by weaving together statistics and specific judicial appointments. Let's trace their logic here. First, the commentators cite Cato Institute data showing refugee admissions had dropped by 90% under the previous administration. But then, they point out that Judge John McConnell, an Obama appointee, struck down policies effectively forcing the restarting of work permits and asylum claims. So why does this legal maneuver matter to the everyday viewer? Well, because, as the sources argue, these populations are subsequently funneled right into sanctuary cities. There, they're counted in the census. That census data then artificially amplifies the state's population numbers, which in turn actually boosts their electoral college weight and representation in Congress. The overarching argument here is that activist judges are circumventing the will of the people to permanently alter the voting registry, totally diluting the power of the everyday citizen.
Section 5. Anatomy of viral narratives. Having looked at these distinct pillars, from media distrust to local elections to immigration law, let's examine how this entire independent media ecosystem actually synthesizes these points into a single cohesive worldview.
Let's look at the actual anatomy of this viral moment. Notice how the commentators seamlessly weave a catalyst, the NBC interview walk-off, with a local grievance, like California's mail-in ballot counting. Then they tie this directly to a national threat, specifically H-1B visa fraud and open borders. Ultimately, all of this funnels into one core theme: a completely rigged system managed by elites. For the viewer consuming this media, these aren't just isolated events. The hostile interviewer, the slow ballot counting, and the activist judges are all presented as interlocking pieces of an establishment that just wants to keep the average citizen in the dark.
One of our sources explicitly defines this media battle. Speaking from the perspective of a rhetoric professor, they argue that mainstream media is guilty of architecting a narrative. Basically, that's the rhetorical practice of deliberately leaving out contextual nuances and selectively framing facts to sway public perception. And honestly, that is exactly why these independent commentators feel so compelled to aggressively build their own counter-narratives. They feel they have to connect the dots for their audience, because they genuinely believe the traditional press is actively working against them.
As you think about the takeaways from this explainer, ask yourself this. In an era where a single interview can spark complex webs of political theory, how heavily do independent media ecosystems shape your understanding of reality? Just look at how masterfully these sources connected a microphone drop in Wisconsin all the way to an H-1B visa application from India. It's like a giant puzzle. How heavily does the media you consume connect the dots between breaking news and your core political beliefs? It's a truly fascinating look at modern digital persuasion. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.